Okay, I'll kick off. This is an introduction to the theory of sailing, and it's the first of what I hope, technology willing, will be the first of 8 talks spread out over the month. We'll try and do them twice a week. And I'm assuming that most of you know absolutely nothing about sailing, and even if you do, that's the way I'm going to address you, as if you know nothing about sailing. And hopefully try and bring you along. And one of the things that I'm going to start with is the mystery, if you like, of what actually makes a boat go. People can well imagine that you're blown along by the trade winds or whatever weather system you use to get your boat going. But we somehow managed to be able to sail upwind, which is quite a remarkable achievement. If you go back to the times of the ancient monks, you'll have seen that the Vikings, which arrived to see them and were probably the last thing they saw, came in a boat like this, a Viking longship. It was able to go upwind, but it could only do that because it had galley slaves on board which could row the boat when the wind wasn't blowing in the right direction. But other than that, it could only sail to a limited degree around the wind. And I'll just show you another picture here that will hopefully illustrate some of that point. Yeah, one thing, incidentally, from a technology viewpoint, which the Vikings lacked on their boat, was this little item here at the bottom of the boat. Now, you might think it's something, I'm sorry about all these things that appear. This little here that my giant cursor is pointing at is called a centerboard. On a bigger yacht, it would be called a keel. And it would also have a ballast function in that there'd be a ton of lead in it to keep the boat upright in strong winds. We just have a piece of plywood if we're sailing a dinghy, a smaller boat. And that's probably one of the most significant advances in sailing technology ever made. It stops the boat being blown sideways by the wind and enables it to keep its course, a bit like the fin in an airplane, which stops the plane wobbling about in the sky. I'll just run through the various parts of the boat here very, very quickly. We'll go through some of this in a bit more detail later. This dinghy has 2 sails. A lot of dinghies, a lot of larger boats indeed, have only 1 sail, and that sail is generally what we call the mainsail. The sail in the front, the little sail in the front, is usually called a jib, although it can also be called a genoa if it's a large jib, but let's call it a jib for the time being. You have a rudder, and you have a tiller, which is the thing you steer with. And on many, many sailboats, you've also got a little tiller extension, this little thing here. And that enables you to sit happily on the side of the boat, looking at your sails and working out what's going on as you sail along. And also, if it's a dinghy, to help you balance the boat. Now, I'll just go back to our other diagrams, points of sailing. To compare our boat, the dinghy or the keel boat, with the Viking boat could only sail, if you like, in the latter half of this diagram. The Viking boat can only sail down here. The wind is blowing from the top of the screen. It always blows from the top of the screen. You can see the arrow there indicating the wind. The Vikings can only sail this way, across the wind, or they can sail in front of the wind. We can go to windward. We can go up here, we can go up here, and we can sail in all these directions relative to the wind. Largely because of that wonderful little device called a centerboard or a keel. There's no sailing possible for either us or the Vikings directly into the wind. We cannot sail directly into the wind, but in a way we can, because we can zigzag upwind. We can sail the boat this way and then turn and sail it that way, always keeping the same angle to the wind, and eventually you will reach the top of the screen, I promise you. change direction through a process known as tacking. When we are going upwind, we tack the boat, as we call it, and we head up this way. And I'll go to a little piece of video, which hopefully will show you a bit of tacking in action. This is Shirley Robertson, the sort of thinking sailors pin-up, as it were. She's an Olympic gold medalist. She won a very impressive gold medal in the Olympics a few years ago. And she made this little video for the Royal Yachting Association, which I have purloined bits of because she does this very well. She's sailing a single-sailed, single-handed boat, which is a Pico. We have boats very similar to this, incidentally, which we use for the various sailing programs that we have on a Saturday morning, which, given the opportunity, I will tell you all about in a few minutes. So let's let Shirley show her stuff. She's going to bring the front of the boat. I keep pointing and you can't see my fingers, of course. She's going to bring the front of the boat through the no-go zone. In other words, that area where neither we nor the Vikings can go, directly into the wind, which she's going to then pass through the wind and come out the other side. So she's going to point the boat upwind fairly vigorously so that it goes through the wind. If you can imagine the wind coming from up here, she'll tack it through the wind. And Shirley, show us your stuff.
Holding the tiller extension in the dagger grip, I lead with my back foot first. Turn the boat through the wind.
Now,
Swap sides, back onto the reach, and now I'm steering with the tiller extension behind my back. I bring my main sheet hand to the tiller extension. I take my free hand and grab the main sheet, holding the tiller as if I'm frying an egg, and off I go. And just when I'm comfortable, I can swap back to a dagger grip. Completely stuck.
no, just stop. Now, just pause it there. You can see Shirley puts up this diagram, which I think it probably even more colorfully illustrates the situation. You cannot sail directly up here, following that arrow into the no-go zone. The wind is coming from the top of the screen. The boats can go this way, they can go that way. What you can do, though, if you want to get to the top of the screen, is you go over here, you turn the boat, you tack it, and you go up that way, and you tack it again until you reach your destination. So what Shirley is now demonstrating is the actual physical act of tacking, and I'll try and talk you through this rather than listen to her.
The first steps are learning to sail on a beam route, backwards and forwards, tacking at either end.
Now, she's tacking to continue it now.
I'm going to show you how to tack from a reach to a reach. Holding the tiller extension in the dagger grip, I lead with my back foot first. Turn the boat through the wind.
Now, I just realized I'm showing you the wrong clip, but this is still a tack, so let's watch it.
Sides, back onto the reach. And now I'm
You can see the boom has gone over to the other side of the boat.
I bring my main sheet hand to the tiller extension. I take my free hand and grab the main sheet, holding the tiller as if I'm frying an egg, and off I go. And just when I'm comfortable, I can swap back to a dagger grip.
So I just move forward to where she goes from a close hold to a close hold. In other words, sailing into the wind. This looks scary. Now she's doing another tack for us here.
Point in the no-go zone means sailing as close as possible to the wind and tacking backwards and forwards, zigzagging towards the upwind target.
Here she goes. Now you can see in this instance, her sail is pulled in closer to the center line of the boat, which is where you would have it if you're sailing close hauled. In other words, going up into the wind.
Zone, which means I have to tack from sailing close hauled to close hauled. The main difference between this tack and the reach to reach tack is that it's a much smaller angle. And one important thing to remember is to look before you tack to avoid an embarrassing collision. I put my back foot across first.
She's doing it again now.
Push the boat.
See, the sails have gone through the wind and out the other side. You change side of the boat and the sails also change the side of the boat that they're on. She's doing it again.
Smaller angle, sail fills, And when I'm ready, swapping my hands.
Okay, we'll leave that for a second and go back to some more diagrams. The other thing I think that mystifies people is the actual science of sailing. What actually is happening when you sail a boat? How can you go upwind like that? And it's a bit of a mystery. Sometimes it's even a mystery to me, but it works. And I'm going to look at some diagrams here for you now. Now we've looked at the sailing diagrams where you go in the no-go zone or where you can't go in the no-go zone. And there's another diagram here actually puts this a little bit more graphically, if I can get it to move. That's this one here. I'll just increase that. You can see that the boat that has found itself in the unhappy position of being head to wind, if you can read that there, its sails are flapping. It's going nowhere. And in fact, if you don't do anything, it's going to blow backwards. There are little maneuvers you can do. I won't go into them now. That'll help you get out of that situation. It's called being in irons. Whereas the two boats that have borne away a little, they're not pointed up as high, are able to sail quite happily, close hauled. Another thing I want you to look at is the position of the sails on some of these boats. As I pointed out with Shirley when she was sailing in the little bit of video, her sails were close into the center of the boat, especially the mainsail, but the jib also. And if you come down here where you see the boat sailing across the wind, the sails are let out a little bit more. And when you're going away from the wind in these three rough directions, I mean, you can sail at any point of the compass. You don't have to necessarily follow these lines. But your sails are out further. They're almost out at 90 degrees to the boat here when you're going dead before the wind. So that's an interesting point to remember. A lot of these diagrams are viewed from above, which is possibly the best way to do them. They have little arrows representing the wind and also little arrows representing the direction you end up going in. This is the direction the boat is going in, this little arrow written on the sea. And as you know well, of course, there are no arrows on the sea, but let's pretend there are, and this boat is going forward. The wind is coming on both sides of the sail. It's coming from the forward side and it's coming from this backward side, as it were, of the sail, and that's the general direction of the wind up there, right? This arrow represents the way the boat is going, and it's not pointing directly upwind or in the same angle as this arrow here. It's pointing slightly over towards the side, and that's what's known as the aerodynamic force. And it's a combination of a forward force following this arrow and a sideways force, which is, if you like, the boat being blown down this way, being blown sideways by the wind. This is where our little invention of the last few hundred years, the centerboard, comes in. The keel or the centerboard stops the boat from sliding sideways and converts a lot of that energy generated by the wind into forward motion. So it goes without saying, and again, it's probably a bit too much detail at this stage, but when you're beating, you have to have the centerboard down. And in fact, what we often say to beginners is just put the centerboard down and leave it down for the time being, because you're going to end up beating at some stage. And if you don't have the centerboard down, you'll just drift sideways out of the picture down here. So the centerboard is very important. It's one of the most important controls on the boat. Looking at that in a little bit more detail, we're looking down. You can imagine a slice through the sail. An interesting thing about the sail is its curvature. And those of you who know anything about flying or aviation and things like that will realize that's not unlike the shape of an airplane wing. Just that bit there. So the wind is going one side of it, it travels further and longer to get around, and it accelerates, as it were, to catch up with the wind, which has gone on the inside of the sail. In so doing, it is producing this sideways arrow of this sideways force. And as you can see, that sideways force is pointing slightly above the horizontal. In other words, it's made up, I don't know if you know much about vectors and things like that, but it's made up of two components. One is the sideways force, and that sideways force will come out here a bit, but it's also got forward propulsion, a forwards force. And that forward force is helping the boat move forward. On a beat, close hold, going upwind, most of the effort, or most of the force that's generated is to the side. So you and your crew, or you, if you're on your own on the boat, are going to have to sit on this side of the boat to stop it tumbling over, basically, because unless it's a keelboat with a ton of lead under it, because of this sideways force. So in one sense, beating, going upwind, is slightly more energetic. It's very much more energetic than any other point of sailing. You get a great body workout. You know, your torso muscles will be very firm after a few years sailing. This is another diagram illustrating pretty much the same thing, but the arrows are in different. You see they are in different formats. The wind is coming in this way. You've got a force to the side, and you've got a force up forwards. The smaller arrow represents the smaller force, the smaller drive, as it were, compared to the sideways force. And this arrow, I suppose, is nominal in that the centerboard being down prevents this action taking place, and it's the boat tending to slide through the water sideways. But we've got our centerboard down, or our keel down, so that's not going to happen. Possibly. This again, if you want to convert all this to parallelograms of forces, this is when you're reaching, when you're going sideways to the wind. So the wind is coming from the bottom of the diagram. Your sail is out further, so you're not going to get so much of a heeling force. You're going to get more of a driving force. So if you look at the two little arrows here in front of the boat, this little arrow, because we're beating in the lower diagram, we're trying to go upwind in the lower diagram, is shorter. We're sailing much freer in this diagram, so that forward propulsion arrow is longer. So when the wind is coming in from the side of the boat, it's really happy days. This is the most efficient point of sailing there is, and your boat will go faster and with less effort from you when you're going across the wind. In other words, you're sailing at right angles to the wind.
So it's actually not the fastest going from when the wind is from behind.
No, yeah, that's actually a very good point. Everybody imagines that with the wind dead behind you, you're going to go faster. You're not.
Yeah, that's what I assumed.
Yeah, because when the wind is dead behind you, you are being pushed along. You might as well put up the sheets off your bed than the sail in some cases, for all the good it'll do you. When you're sailing across the wind, and even more dramatically into the wind, you are harnessing a second type of energy, aerodynamic force. The curvature of those wings, the curvature of those sails. In an aeroplane, the curvature of the wings enables the plane to get off the ground. 50 tons of metal and people can be lifted off the ground thanks to these aerofoil shapes in the wings. And we have similar aerofoil shapes in the sails, or we can maneuver the sails so that we do. There are various controls you can use on the sail, but let's just assume they all look like that. That's the shape of an airplane wing, that's the shape of a sail. It generates an aerodynamic force. So it's especially important in going upwind, when you're going into the wind or towards the wind. That little arrow there is, you might say, is that all we get from the sails? But when you consider this, the wind is trying to blow you backwards. Look at the direction of those wind arrows. That wind is trying to blow you backwards, and you're still going forwards. You're generating this lift, this aerodynamic force in the sails. To a degree, although more scientifically minded among you might sniff at this, but to a degree, you're being sucked upwind. You know, it's almost like that. You're being sucked upwind, and it works quite well. The average sailboat is designed to go upwind, so there's a lot of effort put into designing a boat so that it can harness the wind in that respect. But going across the wind is, curiously enough, its fastest motion, as it were. You really speed along quite happily. And you're starting to be able to use a third sail here, a spinnaker, which are the big, colourful, balloon-like sails you'll often see in front of boats out in Dunleary or Holt or even Skerries. We use them. So, does that answer your question, Attilio?
Yeah, thank you.
So I think we've effectively, these are all diagrams from different books, which in one sense or another show it a little bit better. This boat uses the dirty word suction, or this diagram uses the dirty word suction, which I don't disagree entirely with. It's not really suction, but it's a good way of imagining it. And here's the difference. Here, the controls of your boat are very simple. You have the rudder, you have this to steer with, you have the centerboard, obviously, which we talked about, or the keel. And we also have ropes attached to the sails. And here's a boat which is just sitting there. We've let the sails go, and the sails are flapping, and you're not going anywhere very fast. You'll move imperceptibly a little bit, a few yards a minute, but not very fast and not very purposefully. If you pull that rope, you see the wriggly bit of rope at the top of my cursor arrow there, you'll pull the sail in, it will catch the wind, and happy days, away you go. You'll start sailing. Okay. Again, a lot of this stuff we'll go into in a little bit more detail later on. Again, more of the same. The drive on the sail is generated in different directions, depending on which part of the sail is most used. And you can see these little arrows here are all saying more or less the same thing. This is a trick. When we're finished, I want you all to rush into your kitchens and do this, because it illustrates how you can get a bit of drive from a sail. We use a spoon. The bigger the spoon, the better. Hold it very, very tenderly with, you know, tender grip at the top so that it can swivel in your hand, and back it into a smooth stream of water coming out of your tap. And you will find that it is sucked forward about a centimetre into the tap. Once it meets that stream of water, it'll be sucked into the flow of water. And that is similar to what happens to your boat when it meets the wind. If you can, the water is, if you like, a proxy for the wind, but it does the same thing. When it passes over the back of a spoon, it will suck it in. If you can imagine that happening with a big sail, it does the same thing. So try that at home, and it's good fun. The other thing we'll get our heads around as well is the fact that a boat has two sails. And it's an interesting point, again, getting back to the word aerodynamic, that a boat with two sails will go, which are positioned one in front of the other like this, will go faster than a boat with two sails, the same two sails. If we put one sail up at the front of the boat and we move this sail down here towards the back of the boat, and you will get little boats that are actually designed like that. But in this case, they will not go as fast as the boat with two sails close to each other. And the reason for that is that the jib, when it's used dynamically with the main sail, the big sail at the back, as it were, generates power far bigger than its size. It controls the flow of air over the back of the main sail, this flow of air coming through here, coming through what we call the slot. And that accelerates the boat quite dramatically. It's quite dramatic. Two boats exactly the same. One of them doesn't use their jib, the other uses their jib. The one that's using the jib and the mainsail together is gone way up the course far faster than the other boat. So that's fairly important. Maintaining this slot, incidentally, for different points of sailing, when you let the mainsail out as you go off the wind, you let the jib out as well a bit. When you're going up into the wind, say, you know, beating or close hold, you bring both sails in. You bring this sail in towards the center line and you bring this one in with it. All the time trying to maintain this kind of ratio, this kind of distance between the two sails, and generates a lot of power. It's quite remarkable. I've seen people getting dragged out to sea. An interesting thing to remember is you always hold a boat when you're launching it on the slipway, like a horse, always hold it up here, right? But one day I watched this person, and I won't mention his or her sex, and they were holding onto the boat here. And these two sails had already been cleated in. They'd been pulled in and locked in position, what we call cleated, locked into position. And the boat just took off when a gust of wind hit it and carried her out into the harbour. In one sense, it was very amusing. She was terrified. There, I've given her sex away. Shouldn't have done that. But, always think of a horse. Just hold it by up here. But the power, she was remarking on this, and it was actually a good lesson for those of us that were watching. A, always hold it by the bow, but B, the power of the sails is quite remarkable, the pulling power of the sails, that it can drag an adult hanging onto the side out into the harbour. Now, when I say out into the harbour, she went out about 10 yards and we waded in after her and pulled her in again. So quite an amount of power in those sails. I think that's all I'm going to show you on the sciencey bit. And I just go through some, I don't know how much time we have, 20:57, and we're still going. I just go through some pictures of boats sailing and just talk generally about them and let you, give you some sort of an idea of, point I was making, admire the curves there. That really sums up a lot of sailing, especially sailing upwind. And I'm an awful bore because when I get somebody in the boat with me, all I want to do with them is beat up, you know, beat or go close hold or sail closer to the wind, because this is the, I suppose, the trickiest part of sailing. The rest of it is fairly easy. You know, you just let your sails out until the boat is going as fast as possible, and that seems to be the golden rule. Whereas beating, it's like learning to walk and chew gum. You've got to be able to do both and whistle. So he's sailing quite nicely there. And you can see he's sitting out on the side of the boat, and this is always something you should aim to do, is sit facing opposite the sails. Always be looking into your wind-filled sail, because a lot of the controls for a boat and a lot of the maneuvers and the procedures assume that that's what you're doing, you know. So sit facing opposite the sail, one of the little rules. See if we can get some more pictures. Can you see that, guys?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now this is same type of boat, same race, presumably, but the boat is now going downwind. His sail is right out. His jib could be out as well, but the mainsail anyhow is right out. The boat beyond him has his mainsail right out as well, you know, as far away from the center of the boat as possible. But he's also put up a spinnaker, and the spinnaker is particularly good for going downwind, but you can also use it for reaching, in other words, going across the wind. But those boats, despite one having the spinnaker up and so forth, they are just being propelled, they're being pushed along by the wind, like you'd see a paper bag being blown down the street. The technology is not much different. They are being blown along. I race a dinghy, not these ones, but fairly similar in size. And there's a guy in our fleet, and he never uses a spinnaker, never puts it up, because they can be a little bit troublesome, you know, things get tangled and so forth. So he never uses a spinnaker. And there are times when we're going downwind, and he's if not faster, he's every bit as fast as I am. And I'm going to all the trouble of putting up a spinnaker for going downwind, because there is absolutely no aerodynamics at play going downwind. You're just being pushed along by the wind. Whereas the rest of the points of sailing, going across the wind, going upwind, in, you know, up towards the top of the screen, as it were, you are developing aerodynamic force, shape of the sails, all that sort of thing. Very important and fascinating. I find it fascinating. I really do. These are future talks, the tides, weather, and all that sort of thing. And we'll get back to a lot of this sort of thing as well, and go into a little bit more detail on some of the things that I've talked about tonight. So, any questions? I was going to finish with a little video of some of the sailing we do here in Skerries on Saturday mornings for beginners. People, we have a process called Just Sailing, which I'm involved with it. Kieran Brannigan, former Commodore, is involved in it. Helen Ryan is also involved. She helps pull all the things together, and also bakes a beautiful cake every Saturday morning. So when we're finished sailing, we can come into the clubhouse and eat cake and do our adventures. We go on little trips occasionally. We teach sailing, and not just me, but lots of people. Liam O'Callaghan, for example, our current Commodore, who's out there somewhere watching in on us, also comes along, lends his boat and himself indeed, and takes people out sailing and shows them the ropes. So it's a fabulous program. We can get 20 odd people out sailing. People keep giving us boats. This is the marvelous thing about it. We now have a little fleet of about 6 or 7 dinghies. We've one of these, a Mermaid, beautiful boat. There's usually a fight as to who goes out in it. And the latest addition to the fleet is a small cruiser, 23-foot cruiser, which is available for us to sail pretty much exclusively. And we'll be encouraging people to take that for little trips, you know, down to Rush or Holt or that sort of thing. We often go to Balbriggan for ice cream, which, if the wind is right, is a good little treat. So I'll try and find you a little video. While I'm doing that, any other questions?
I'm curious about the expression sailing close to the wind.
Okay, yeah. Well, sailing close to the wind is, if we go back to this other picture, is what these guys were doing in the earlier picture. No, back the other way. Yeah, they're sailing close to the wind. If he comes up any further to here, say if he puts the bow of his boat pointing towards us, almost directly towards us in the picture, he's going to lose aerodynamic force, and his sails will stall to a degree. His sails will start flapping, and he's lost it. He's going to have to steer away again until his sails fill with the wind again. So that's sailing close to the wind. We don't use it. It's become one of these analogies which we don't use in sailing. We would say close hold, or sailing as high as we can. But it's a thing you should try to do, is sail as close to the wind as you possibly can. And it gets more interesting. Another little thing I'll try and point out in this photograph, you're not seeing this as a thumbnail, are you?
No.
Okay. These are you're always encouraged to look at your speedometer and that sort of thing when you're driving a car. When you're sailing a boat, these are the two, especially going upwind, especially sailing close to the wind, if I may use that analogy again. See these two little pieces? They're little pieces of thread or little pieces of wool. See them? It's another setup there. Some boats have more. And there are similar things on the mainsail, sometimes at the very back of the sail. But the ones on the jib are very, very important. And watching those little pieces of, that one is perfectly aligned, the angle of the two pieces of thread. That tells you you have your sails, the jib at any rate, set perfectly, and you're sailing towards the wind. Now the top one is breaking away a little. You see this one is flying up in the air. And
detaching from the wind, yeah.
Yeah, if the skipper is looking at that and he's other things at his mind, they're having great fun there in the boat and a good laugh. But if he was in a race now, he'd be watching that and he'd be asking himself, why is it doing that? Now, I can't tell what side of the sail it's on. Depending on the side of the sail it's on, it can tell you you're about to go into the wind too much. You're going to sail too close to the wind. Or it could mean you're sailing a bit far away from the wind and you want to get the two aligned, depending on which side of the sail it's on, and you want to get the two aligned. But for most of you, well, those of you who are beginning sailing, to get to be even at that stage and to be able to keep a boat lined up like that is doing pretty well. It takes a bit of concentration. You'll get used to it after a while. And the world isn't going to end if you don't get it right. You know, the boat will still go. You won't win the race, but the boat will still go. So I'll just see if I can find that little video. It's in here somewhere. No, not the one. Oh, here we go. Just sailing videos. Just sailing is the name of the thing we do. This is a little trip we made a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, and we sailed down to Rush. Can everybody see that incidentally?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. There's no commentary, just background music. That boat you see there is owned by us and it's available for people to sail. This is Neil and Natalia, Niall and Natalia sailing it. Oh, they're sailing my boat actually. Yeah, the blue one, that's my boat now. The one in the background that we're all leaving behind is Kieran Brannigan's boat. They had to get married after that. Now you see the telltales? See them now? They're perfect, beautiful. Another nice shot of the telltales. See them up here? Look. Nicely positioned. Getting into Rush is quite tricky. And they actually sent motorboats out to meet us, to guide us in. We were that hopeless.
That's my house.
I don't know what whether they were laughing at the camera on my head or whether they just had such a great time sailing down. I like to think the latter. This is something which some of you are still probably mystified with, is how we get the sails up. And as you can see, there are pulleys at the top of the mast and a line going up through the mast. And when you pull down on the line, the sail goes up. We'll do that ad nauseum on Saturday mornings for those of you who join us. Now, we're close hauled now, close to the wind. Sails are pulled in. You can see the slot. Spinnaker up now. We are, as it were, just being blown along, very little to aerodynamic force, but very pleasant nonetheless. Okay, that's pretty much everything I wanted to say. Any comments from any of you anything you want to talk about before we finish up?
Thanks very much, Gerry.
Not at all, you're very welcome.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Gerry, that was really good.
Thanks, Gerry. Very good. Gerry.
Good job as always, Gerry.
Cheers, Gerry. I'll send you some cake.
That's right.
Sorry, we're going to have virtual cake now, I suppose. Yeah. Here.
Certainly Miss Allen's
So next Monday, 8 p.m. again.
Yeah, good point. We'll do this again next Thursday night, if you can make it. Next Thursday night. I'll send out another invitation.
Please. Yeah.
And hopefully I'll get it right this time. I'll check with people instead. Just try and find out how many people were trying to get in tonight that didn't make it. And I might actually run this session again for their benefit. Or failing that, see if the little recording that we have is any use, and maybe if people can catch up that way. Hopefully they can, but we'll try and do it Mondays and Thursdays. We were able to go on quite a long time. I thought we were only going to get about half an hour or 40 minutes, but they haven't pulled the plug on us yet. So the reason for the reason for the frequency is the shorter time, so that it wouldn't take up too much time for people. So we'll try again on Thursday night, following Monday, following Thursday, and we'll go on like this for about 8 sessions. And again, if there's anything anybody has any questions about or would like to see done in more detail, please get in touch. Okay, so I'll wrap it up there.